Welcome everyone to the fifth Masterclass YouTube of Coursera. And Coursera is featuring me, Dr. Aaron Sheley, at the colleges USC, University of Southern California, as an adjunct professor, and California Institute of the Arts, and Harvard. And Harvard and all those schools that I just mentioned, and other schools that they allow Coursera Masterclass YouTube on when it is a professor, are typically also run by the Board of Education, and that the Board of Education has been very good to me, as has Masterclass, and accruing the right kind of knowledge and information and data that it takes to teach a Masterclass. I had to get several PhDs, not just one, and it sounds really impossible to get one, and then there's several, and then you're doing something like working for an institution and graduating from an institution, and then finally it's like you've done all the work, you've done all the press, you've done all the things you needed to do, and you come out the other side. And then one of the options you have as a professor is teaching at the school, or teaching like Coursera does remotely to a school, or any school that takes it as remote. This particular class is 16 units. It's the films of Orson Welles, and you get 4 units completed if you finish all the lectures, and this is lecture 5. If you finish them to 14 and see them all, and then you take the final from Coursera, then you pass with the credits. So it sounds easy, but some of these times I'll be lecturing and I'm even thinking, man, if I was a student here, I'd be going back through these lectures and they'd be getting really hard to even remember the second time. So maybe instead of having always from memory, I'm looking at finally a page in front of me on the computer, and I may show you before this class is over, but it looks as though we see Orson Welles films. And when I look at the bottom where it all started, it has a short film called 12th Night. Now, we've seen that in film school at USC, but it was all these Shakespeare plays by Orson Welles that were coming out around the time he was really interested in theater, when he was getting into film, short film, in as early as the 1930s. And that Citizen Kane was 1940s, and War of the Worlds on the radio was in the 30s. The Hearts of Age must have been around the time of the War of the Worlds, or at least more in relation to when War of the Worlds ran. So for it to be avant-garde, and it to be Hearts of Age, and then for War of the Worlds to be kind of the sci-fi, which sci-fi is abstract, but it's typically dealing with what things would look like in the future, projected by us now, and projected by science now, as how it would be then predicted. And a lot of times that comes true in sci-fi, like with H.G. Wells, where it's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and then years later the submarine was actually invented after that book came out. And Orson Welles already was playing with pieces of like metaphor that were dealing with, he's already foreseen this sort of rise of the end of prohibition and back into the sort of like big holiday when the 1950s get here, and we'll be building these big altars to movie stars at that time, and they did. But like when in the 40s, it's more of a time of film noir, and film noir incidentally being the predominant kind of movie of the 40s. It's not always expensive, like the movie Detour was made on the fly, and it's not that it's like not expensive, because you still have to get the arc water vapor lamps, or like anything that can make and add to the chiaroscuro, which is the way the set looks like there's a lightning gauge through it. It's sort of this expressionistic crescendoing jaggedness off screen and on. So we know Orson Welles, after he got out of avant-garde and he did the Mercury Theater, we see this one here, it says Too Much Johnson as director. That one we'll have to mark down and actually look at it. I have heard of The Green Goddess, and these are both before Kane, and really They didn't count as Kane, but Turner Classic Movies did have Too Much Johnson on its channel, and it seemed as though it was a slapstick comedy kind of, but it was also like this kind of endearing family tale, and it wasn't anything like what Orson Welles had wanted it to be. None of his earlier films before Citizen Kane were what he wanted them to be at all. They weren't anything like the ones he made of the same name. So then you get up to Citizen Kane, and we covered that in Lecture 1 or Lecture 2, and it's important to see how noir and Hitchcockianism is affecting Citizen Kane. Because with Hitchcock, everything is either montage or mise-en-scène, and a lot of times it's a blend of the two. He uses the mise-en-scène and then the montage. One example of both of those being used at once is Rear Window, when you see a set filmed across the way through a window that's like triangular, like a film stadium, like the screen. And Citizen Kane, like these film noir films at that time, was using that to project this sort of egregious existential expressionism. And it's because of Hitchcock that there's montage and mise-en-scène all throughout Citizen Kane. In some scenes, it's like shot to shot, like a classical Hollywood cinema, where it's establishing, and then it's middle shot, and then it's close-up. But like sometimes in Citizen Kane, it can be a long shot for a while. Or it can be like that news on the march at the beginning saying Charles Foster Kane is dead. That's a montage, like it'll go to an image and it'll explain what it is in narration, go to an image and explain what it is in narration. And so those elements are where we would describe the film noir as we see it with Citizen Kane, Magnificent Ambersons, and then we come to Journey into Fear. Now, Journey into Fear is one that I have seen, but it's really hard to explain. There's this thing where Joseph Cotten, yet again, is caught in another suspense thriller that you don't, like Shadow of a Doubt by Hitchcock, and you don't know if Journey into Fear is going to end the same way as the other Joseph Cotten movies have, even Shadow of a Death, that expose him as the character of the villain. That Journey into Fear turns out where he's innocent is only one ending of that film. There were many endings to Citizen Kane and Magnificent Ambersons originally when they were trying out the film. Films are no different than back when they were making Birth of a Nation, and they had like 5 different endings, and they didn't know which one to go by, so they went by the preview audience and had them pick the ending, and nobody really knows why that process didn't come about sooner, because they had the audience be like prepared to see maybe even an alternative ending, or if they had seen the one ending, they might have written why they preferred it, and another audience arbitrarily wrote a better article about why the ending should be preserved. Anyway, they didn't always go by that. A lot of times it was the studio head that would come in, watch the film, watch all the endings, and pick the ending. And that's not a bad thing, because really, when you're making films, it's like this assembly anyway. And you're assembling all the parts, and as you're going, you might assemble something that was like scripted way later than like scripted earlier. And so as you're assembling, you're trying to follow the script sort of traditionally. And that's why the edits are so seamless, is because the dialogue floats along no matter which way the camera turns. You don't have to see the actor's lips for the dialogue to fly. So it really doesn't matter that there's other scenes in movies that you never see, because all movies have those scenes that they filmed for the movie that may or may not have been in there. And some producers say that just to leave it in their hands, and they'll fix it the way it needs to go, and the director never gets to see it. So he just figures that they did a good job. And really, if it looks that good and it feels that good and you know you made it, the idea is you make it while You're making it, therefore you watch the film while you're making it. And you usually know, and you can tell with these Orson Welles movies that he's like busy like working with a camera off screen, or that he's busy working with a crane shot off screen, and that he's getting these like Greg Toulon shots. But like Greg Toulon is getting the real Greg Toulon shots. And so in Citizen Kane, it doesn't matter that there were a lot more puzzle pieces that could have been added, because they could have had the scene where Thomas Ince got killed, for instance. And it was good that they assembled the version they did. I think it's like, you got to count your blessings when you get a film edited, because you think everything you needed in there is in there. And then Magnificent Ambersons, we talked about, kind of goes the other way, where it kind of goes downhill. It goes downhill and crashes like the car. That's what we said. It's icy cold dimensions. Monitor its icy cold outdoors weather. And the aristocracy that they are of the family never switches off its everything can be gained by money button. And it also talks about technological industrialism, because technological industrialism is where, for instance, in Magnificent Ambersons, the building of the car, the assembly line building of the car. And it doesn't show that in this film, and it doesn't show workers building it. It just shows what it is to have one when you're in the aristocracy and they don't exist yet. And the point he's making is that they're these really, really rich, blasé, naive, genuine people. Joseph Cotton's a really good actor in that one. That sometimes they like to get drunk. That they have many parties at their house because their house is so huge. And that everything about them is exaggerated. It's not as film noir, but it's like Rebecca, because you see the ceilings of the buildings in the place. So we cover through this idea that this blasé, naive aristocracy loses this bet and has to take in a car, and it ends up being their favorite thing ever until it crashes, and then everyone kind of just says, well, we're gonna help pay for that young girl that came here, and she was nice, and she needs a car too, and we're all gonna lay in the hospital till we tell you that. And it's kind of heartwarming if you look at what they're saying in the film. There aren't many discrepancies on how the upper class is represented. And it doesn't seem that Orson Welles was really calling out any of them like from a Bolshevik idea. It wasn't. Like Orson Welles may have gotten into communism later. Really, I don't ever think he did. But if you look at it, he was kind of avoiding that like other radio stars and TV stars, kind of avoiding the blacklist so he didn't miss TV programming, radio programming. But that was later on, But in Magnificent Ambersons, you don't really get this idea that they are this rigid aristocracy who kills people off to keep their own power. It's like they're like now that there were people in that movie that were interested in that there were friends, and they talked too shortly about it, is part of the fun of the rondo of going through each character's eccentricities by finding out their guests' eccentricities. And having a car even at this point in the film is weird, because you feel like you're still in this period piece where you feel like a car is a brand new to the world and you haven't seen it again. And it's a really good effect of that, of modernism, nostalgia, and up close and personal shots and dialogue looping, lots of looping, different characters, ensemble or looping dialogue. They did that in Citizen Kane, or they'd record a certain section of dialogue and kind of circle it, and then record another section of dialogue and kind of circle it and put them a little bit of overlap. So then you kind of fade one and fade the other and kind of loop them in the fade. And those kind of sound loops are perfect because Robert Altman used them, and it's really to where you can put a sound loop, record it even digitally onto a film, and then you can manipulate the sort of specks of the loop by looping it and crossing over on top or on bottom with the other track, with the two tracks of dialogue that you've recorded. And then it gets this realistic effect because everyone's talking around the same time that they would. And it's still, all movies still match usually the lip sync, but some movies are like Ozu or whatever. He shoots a frame straight down box down the middle, and you could face him straight away as a Japanese. But he wouldn't have always overlapped the music. Sometimes he puts the dialogue of a scene straight across. And if it goes straight across, then you're reading the dialogue while the lips are moving on screen because it's being recorded at the same rate it's being recorded as the soundtrack. Which in Hollywood films, the soundtrack gets really extensively cumbersome. And I think that's because we have a movie even like Touch of Evil coming up later. And Touch of Evil, we're like, yeah, that's a movie about a soundtrack. Like, you know, like that movie with Gene Hackman called, not The Conformist, but they were in this, The Conversation. Yeah, it was this Gene Hackman film called The Conversation by Francis Ford Coppola, and it comes in, and it reminds me so much of Touch of Evil at the end, because they found something on the soundtrack that was a clue to a murder, just like in Blowout or Blow Up, you know. And, you know, so that they were using tricks of sound manipulation to record the tricks of sound manipulation shown, the sound manipulation tricks, and then they could catch the killer because they had it on record who it was, and the movie showed them making that recording, and later you see it played back in such a way that it villainizes the Orson Welles character so much. And that's what the point of the show and tell tape effect does, because you record it, and while it's on, you're getting him to say things that he wouldn't say in front of a big crowd. But if you were kind of like recording him like in The Conversation, where there's a lot of looping in that, where there's dialogue on dialogue, and he's recording it as he's talking, and he still ends up with some evidence recorded that will totally shake the meaning of his case, you know. And so these ideal recording things are like self-reflexive. It's like, this is us showing you how we record a film to show the process of recording a film so that you too could do the process of recording a film and record film. That's the self-reflexivity. What we get out of it as filmmakers, as watching it, is what we learn the lesson of how to film that scene or that shot. And now we know how to do the sound design and film the sound design being recorded all at the same time for the shot. So then I'm going to say there's Journey into Fear. Oh, we talked about The Stranger. Okay, the story of Samba. It's all true. It's all true. I'm not sure. And Story of Samba, we're going to skip because it's a short. Journey into Fear, we'll come back to. So The Stranger, we talked about. It was the one with the Nazi and Oliver, Orson Welles, and you know, The Stranger, and it had this whole theme of like outsiders, xenophobia, like people from another country being strange, like spies and some kind of espionage things going on. And The Stranger was kind of low budget, but it did pretty well at the box office. Now, the movie that came out next was the very big Lady from Shanghai, and that's the one we're really going to focus on this class, because the Lady from Shanghai is not the most complex film, but it's definitely not the least, because it has this beginning where Orson Welles has kind of got this Irish accent, and he is talking about some kind of poetry, and he's like, it's not a limerick, but he's doing something like that, and he's following this lady in a coach, or he's in this coach with a lady, like a horse-drawn coach and carriage. So it kind of has this opening like Touch of Evil, but Lady from Shanghai is first, 1947. Rita Hayworth's in it. And Rita Hayworth is glowing with beauty from the minute she gets in the frame and thereon. And Lady from Shanghai has a few of the familiar Mercury Theater actors, the RKO guys that Orson Welles worked with, and RKO being a stock that's very valuable, we said, because its last movie, when went on Dangerous Ground or whatever. But even before that, they did King Kong all the way to Citizen Kane, all the way till the end of RKO, which was around the 50s and 60s, when they stopped using the label, that the label had been used 2 or 3 or 4 times after that, makes it so that most of it's a contained file, but that makes it rare because everything else is still growing, so none of it is rare. It's also worth more than any other stock because the stock accrued to where it needed to go, and Citizen Kane and King Kong can attest why, and Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, you can attest to all that as to why RKO is this big theater that Orson Welles is going to. And that the Mercury Theater kind of led him there, sure, but it's like the same kind of wipeout that he did there with War of the Worlds. Now he's on with RKO to have them send these Citizen Kane messages everywhere, and everybody will be deluded with propaganda. And the Lady from Shanghai, speaking of propaganda, the Lady from Shanghai is kind of a classical Hollywood piece, or post-classical. It's right after the war, so it's already sort of cynical, more cynical than Orson Welles' other movies so far, even though Citizen Kane's pretty cynical, right? But the Lady from Shanghai is a femme fatale, the Rita Hayworth character, that she's trying to lure both her older husband and the Orson Welles character, who's like this romantic poet tour guide. And she wants to lure him over to this beach, this rocky beach point near one of their hideouts in the world. They're kind of gangsters. They kind of form a gangster situation between them all. And first of all, Orson Welles is already deciding he's going to break off from him because he doesn't want to deal with her being in love with his husband. But she and Orson Welles do have love-making scenes in that movie. She does lay around as though she's tanning all the time, and she does lay around in contempt, where she's trying to attract both men, and both men are kind of fighting over her, but not really looking at her that much. And then both men deserve the other guy can have her. So there's your knife in the water Lady from Shanghai comparison. Both guys don't want her now. Both guys are pissed, but the lady's just laying there thinking they love her. But Orson Welles is the first to really state that he's going to get out of this situation if she goes back to her husband, and this is really an ongoing thing for them. But it's an interesting movie because by the second half, being at the rocky beaches of Orson Welles, his friend, and Rita Hayworth's character, and Orson Welles is always in character, in these movies. The Rita Hayworth character kind of knows the island where she's at and kind of knows the places she can go nearby with a boat or whatever else. And because it's nearby Ireland, and because it's nearby England and all that out in the ocean, and there's a lot of big stones that are out there that you can kind of just crawl out on and be on and everything. Well, they kind of escape back to this place a little further back, and then last thing you know, they're in this big maze of mirrors. And it's a shootout. And then Orson Welles is coming after Rita Hayworth's character, and that he's shooting at her, and she's running into the mirror maze to not get shot at. Meanwhile, the old man has been killed, and nobody will admit who it was. He's laying dead back on one of the rocks, and he's totally dead, and his ship's all crashed, and he's out of it, and he can't tell the story to Orson Welles' character, and he doesn't know if even he did it because he was drunk, and she was drunk. But she thinks that Rita Hayworth's character thinks that Orson Welles' character did it, and so she chases him, literally on purpose, making us think it may have been her, into the House of Mirrors, but then he's shooting at her. So she must have got lost in the House of Mirrors, and he caught up. But there's so many trick shots in this scene. there's so many trick shots because the mirrors fold in, the mirrors fold up. It's like, all right, there's turned here. She shoots at one, it breaks it down. She's not there. You can tell that reflection wasn't her. Shoot another one down. Maybe she's behind the mirror. She runs off. She's got a gun too. And she shoots back and actually hits him once. And so he gets hit. And this is like a scene that you'll notice, and Orson Welles didn't direct The Third Man, but The Third Man and The Lady from Shanghai have these kind of endings, these Orson Welles, like the not expected ending. And the one in Lady from Shanghai is mirrors and how it's a mirror maze. And you'll see how in other Orson Welles movies, they have these like big endings that are full of like twists and turns, and like be a shootout, and it'll be like caught somewhere, like the end of Strangers on a Train, or like even more like some of the other movies of Orson Welles, not just Othello. Othello has a wild ending, but Third Man is the one that has an under the sewer ending. And it's like La Trow, the French film, but it's like this sewer ending where they're all running under the cobblestones of Vienna, and they're all having this shootout. And so it's really the Lady from Shanghai being the most of the eccentric qualities of the other Orson Welles films, and somewhat about revolution, only in the sense of romantic revolution and how it could lead the future to a more ideal utopia is kind of at stake. That's at stake in all of Orson Welles. Like, there's this idea of utopia you see when you see him and his head behind him, it's way bigger. You see this sort of complementarily narcissism on purpose that's really like trying to be megalomaniac, trying to be the, egoistic driven, but only doing it to such an extreme point that it's pointing out to what these characters are actually showing about their ego, that they're not really these egoistic people in real life. I don't know enough about Orson Welles to say, is he an egoist in real life? In his movies, you can tell like he's making fun of egoism in the way he's being solipsistic, like in Touch of Evil as that cop. His very evil solipsism in that is like a narcissism that winks at itself. And then in some of the versions, like in Lady from Shanghai, he's a narcissist that winks at himself, but is actually can get away with it because he's a nice guy, So you got to watch which direction the characters are winking or going or cluing you in on, because they can send you to another part of the movie, or they can send you to another part of the movie. It's, and then with all these versions that they have, these different movies, that it's really hard to say. I think that the Turner Classic Movies version are the closest to the real Orson Welles media that had come out of all the reprints they had made with him. So, not Thief of Baghdad, here we go. The Lady from Shanghai. The Lady from Shanghai. Well, it was the one that it comes a little bit before Macbeth and Othello. Black magic, again, I'm not familiar with, but The Lady from Shanghai does have this interesting ability to change from super sexy scenes of her hanging out in her swimming wear, or swimming in her swimming wear, kind of like this, connection with swimming women like Esther Williams or whatever, and then like that, the old man, professor guy, he's eventually led to his death and no one knows how it happened. And furthermore, Orson Welles' character is kind of a mystery, because the best he can do is see that it's been crashed and try to kill the woman. This is another kind of stranger mix where you have X, Y, and Z as three characters, and you kind of intertwine them and mix them up and then send them on their way out, either dead or to the other side, wondering what happened to the other characters. And so to build a narrative like that is suited to the situation, which is the camera follows X, Y, or Z and follows them all to a meeting point and then a derivation point. And these were the Mercury Theater's rules too, in the radio station and in some of the TV and stage work they did. So we don't take this film as like being like as critically important when it comes to like Citizen Kane and Magnificent Ambersons, but it's a really well made entertainment piece, and it's probably the first of his films to really be entertainment. And that's why the plot is so shallow and the characters are so shallow, is because it's an entertainment piece, and nobody's trying to make more of this murder mystery than any of them, because they're kind of blasé and spending time in Mélier's kind of lady from Shanghai in it. They're just, she doesn't know why she wants to go with the two of them, but that she goes with the two of them, it all gets messed up. Was she a gold digger, femme fatale? Her femme fatale is the seeming cause of everybody's death but hers, and that just perpetuates forward in a film noir, which we have as The Lady from Shanghai. So before we totally get away from that film, and in the same class we'll go to the next one, which is Othello, and we'll talk a little bit about Othello and Macbeth. But I didn't see how The Lady from Shanghai really showed who did what to who when. Like one of those, it was like a scene of Thomas Ince or something. It was like The Lady from Shanghai, they go out to the sea, and it all happens in like one long line that takes place from left to right. Like first you have this coach, and it's kind of trotting down, and it's coming this way, and he's being Irish, and he's talking to her, and then brrr, they take off on an airplane, and it's like Mr. Arcad, and they take off, and then they are on boat, and they're always going from left to right. Not quite when they get to the maze room after the ship's wrecked and old man is gone. They get to the maze room of the mirrors, and then it's like a fun house. It's like you don't know which mirror is going to lead to where. Somebody's going to be popping up behind the door. And so I want to now switch to the Shakespeare lesson, which started with Twelfth Night. And Twelfth Night is an interesting Shakespeare play because it's where these bards all get together in this like sort of bohemian staffed motel, and they play all these kind of like accidental improv songs that are about things they love and women they love, and they serenade all their women, and they head home with their women. It's very good. Twelfth Night, only Shakespeare. There's sonnets in it. And Macbeth, we all know Macbeth. It's Roman Polanski did it in the 70s, and Orson Welles does it here in the late 40s. And Macbeth is the one where there's those witches, and they need to see out of that one globe, and they see this king, and like how he's got this son, and they both see ghosts, and they talk to ghosts. And so Orson Welles does this Macbeth, and it's really like pieced together, almost Mercury Theater style, but it's also really theatrical realism, to the point that it's so theatrical, it's like meta theatrical. It's like Laurence Olivier. It's like the actors are moving around in an exact line of motion, one way or the other, and they're always, like in Othello, they're always headed up this staircase that's candlelit. Not like in La Belle La Bête, right? And in Macbeth, you get the Shakespeare also in kind of these silhouettes, and that these whole definitions of these screen times of silhouettes are all over the place and all over the wall. And to build those, you film one side of a scrim and the other that blocks out everything behind it except shadow. And then on the other side, you stand behind the scrim facing forward, and it looks like a silhouette of a person. That's how they place silhouettes even in silent film and everything. So you see that with Othello and Macbeth, there's this sort of range of production design that goes beyond The Stranger, and kind of like The Lady from Shanghai has pretty good production design, but it's mostly a moving movie. It's like a road movie. They're always moving in that one, going somewhere, And except when they get to the maze, it's kind of this dead end place, you know. And I'm not going to tell you how it resolves, but Macbeth and Othello, because they're Shakespeare, are going like yonder when the earth was shaken, when earth was shaken unto itself best. Best was the earth shaken unto itself, not indeed for all the rest. Was something that I was saying about Macbeth and Othello's similarities, was that there isn't really a guideline to how you do the theatrical staging of any of the Shakespeare page, so much so in his original notes, though college professors over the years have studied his work and studied how the film versions were printed with the big castles like in Chimes at Midnight and with Twelfth Night where these bards are playing like La Boheme, right? So now we're thinking that all of a sudden he went back to Shakespeare because he owed him a Shakespeare, because he did War of the Worlds or something. You see back in early his career how it complements his later career. He's still doing plays, and now they're such thick, like production design, that you could just like, you're just looking at it like these are the actual sets that this teacher's must have acknowledged towards the Shakespeare set. But that Orson Welles leaves these all pretty low-key is kind of a crazy part of the story. See, because like that these were all low-key in Macbeth and Othello. Othello, he wears blackface, not going to talk about it right now. But the Macbeth and Othello, other than a couple of flaws theatrically, really do tell you that he was in the Shakespeare mode. But his Shakespeare mode was like silhouette, silhouette. Everybody run around on one stage and film it, and we'll just bring the camera, swinging it around, have a 2-camera setup, and film it like a movie. Like, you know, it'll be like the Great Ziegfeld, only it'll be Othello. You know, and then it's Macbeth, and it's like, well, it'll be witches, but it'll be like domestic spaces, too. And like, we'll really get this domesticity action in the hyper theater mode, which is all this big, like, if it was like a Shakespeare cane, it'd be like a cane up to here instead of up to here. You know, I mean, we're just talking like the extra determination of Orson Welles when he's doing Shakespeare. These being his 3, and then Chimes of Midnight being all the Falstaff plays. And we will go into Chimes at Midnight being all the Falstaff plays. But first of all, do you think in Macbeth that the witches really die, or do the witches become ghosts? Is one of the lines from the movie. And when you think about how he situates both the witches and the ghosts, they all seem like ghosts. Kind of like ghosts of witches. And that's kind of what he was going for in that film. That Roman Polanski does the same thing in his Macbeth, where it's the witches, and then they're ghosts, and then they're ghosts of witches. But in that one, they can turn into all 3. In this one, they're just basically ghosts that are witches. It's a very confusing mix-around, because then you get to Othello, and Othello's the story of this black guy who becomes king and gets married to this white princess, and her uncle doesn't want Othello to be with her because he's black, and so he's going to have to send his assistant and himself to kill Othello so he won't marry the princess. And again, it's like one long staircase sequence, only better than The Stranger, the At a Staircase sequence, because it's one of those one more go up the stairs for. Because in Othello, it's like he lives at the top of this tower, and it's got all his like little sacrament pieces of his ideation of this like higher course that he's supposed to be taking. And then it's Orson Welles later that plays Falstaff, and Orson Welles really has a grip of the tradition of Shakespeare. And one thing these actors had to do, and since Orson Welles is an actor in so many of his films, not just his films, but other films that paid for his films, and then Orson Welles will take that memorabilia of being in the Screen Actors Guild and in the Directors Guild. So he's taking that and saying, well, Othello proves that I'm connected to both because it's theatrical, but it's also, it's not only Shakespeare, it's also Orson Welles' film. You know, and Orson Welles is proving that he can be a theatrical actor on that level. which is what happened with Laurence Olivier and so many other directors in that era, in the 40s era, that were doing Shakespeare. That still happens today. Like, you could still see someone doing a Hamlet or a Much Ado About Nothing or anything, and they play it, and then they're connected to the theatrical hyperreal because they've got all the Shakespeare, like, high art. And it still stays a high art with what Much Ado About Nothing. It does. It proves that the actors can be theatrically real, appeal to a Shakespeare side to prove it. And once you've done that, that's where the Shakespeare epic comes from. And so we see how in all of these films, the most important of the Shakespeare ones is Chimes at Midnight. And there's a whole other lecture for Chimes at Midnight that we're getting to later in the course. And I think that it's not really a waste of time for us to study the technique of Orson Welles, because you see, even Lady from Shanghai, which seems to be the most entertaining one, even more so than Magnificent Ambersons, sugar-coated almost, but not really, because it still has a cynical ending where everybody ends up killed or blowing each other away or whatever else. That the pessimistic finale, it always takes over for the actual finale that seems to come earlier, and then all hell breaks loose in the final act of the third act, like the final reduction to the third act. So that Shakespeare writes in 3 acts, yeah, completely. And Orson Welles is more like him already in Citizen Kane, because he kind of has certain things not only told out of sequence, but told in the importance of how the story went, which is actually like Greek theater too. Like the story of Oedipus is kind of out of sequence because it's what important event happened next versus what important event happened a long time ago that helps explain this important event. And what are we leading up to that we have to go back in time and trace to lead up to with the Oedipal problem, right? So you can see that he's got this theater really mixed into film. And I like guys that have theater mixed into film, because film is more like the tradition that comes out of great train robbery or train running into a station or something. And like theater is like character acting, and it's like placement of props, and it's like movement around, blocking around the studio. And it's like you film it, it still has this edge of being theater. And to mix the two, you can use so many creative ideas. Like you can use ideas where it's like part theater, but now it's black and white. You know, you can do like Cyberberg's Parsifal, where it's a real theater of a guy laying down, and then behind him the opera still goes on, and you can still hear the music booming out and everything. So that The Lady from Shanghai has these accents in it, and they're kind of funny, but there wasn't really racism in the film. Maybe sexism in the portrayal of Rita Hayworth as the subjective female, and that she is trying to be looked at, wants to be looked at, likes to be looked at, knows she's going to be looked at, is one of those characters she's playing in the film intentionally so she can get the 2 other men in the film into a fight, into a lockdown, shagdown fight. So we come again to another day of Orson Welles and the films of, and then we say, how do we apply this to our real life? Well, if in your real life all you do is watch movies, then good for you. You're in the right class. If you don't like to, you might want to choose a subject you like. You don't have to stay on with these classes about film. You may not always know what film we're talking about. But the important thing is that you can kind of grasp what I'm saying by the style of the filmmaking, because then you can kind of see how these bombastic shots of Orson Welles and these big like Oedipal conventions of Orson Welles and Shakespearean, and the sort of myth of a Nazi and the myth of the automobile and William Randolph Hearst at a newspaper. All these things we've seen so far are these like big events that were like tidal waves of combustion in these movies, and just like slams at you and crazes at you with Citizen Kane, and then becomes much quieter for a time until Lady from Shanghai, which ends in a bombastic gun shootout. So I think it's good for his career to kind of have these slower going but still artistically directed Othello and Macbeth. I mean, I've seen both, and really, it is a stage that's got cameras on it, and it is a stage that they play trick shots on, and that they go around in size, and that they go up and down these sidewalk stairs, but the whole time they're doing it, the camera's following them, and then like it'll turn around the corner and wait for them to come down, and you're like, this is a total art film watching it, but then it's like all the language of Shakespeare is coming out of it. And you're like, so it's like an artistic version of Shakespeare, which Shakespeare already is pretty much an art film if you even make it. That's why Baz Luhrmann's film is such an art film that he made of Romeo and Juliet, because it was already artistic in the play, where it jumped to in terms of time and space, where it left off in terms of time and space, and then suddenly Romeo and Juliet, the surprise ending, he dies, she dies, he dies, she dies. You know, those were some experimental, like the couple that loved you so much, loved each other so much, they had to die. I mean, that's a great story, and they're going to keep telling that one. And it's like, well, the way he told it was the most extemporaneously experimental, because the two that were fighting to get each other died in each other's arms tonight. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry that happened. No, it wasn't tonight. It was back when they showed Romeo and Juliet. Okay, we're fine. I thought I just died in your arms tonight. No, okay. So, class, I can hear in the background my teacher Zaid getting very remorseful with the one of those chalk pen things. I don't know. And if she writes something on the board like, this was the end of class 5, well, this is the end of class 5. I hope you meet us again for class 6, and we will be talking about Touch of Evil and a few other things that Orson Welles acted in. See, because a couple of the classes that we're going to have devoted to Orson Welles as an actor and what it was films that he showed in and how he did that and what he was doing. So we thank you for coming today or seeing this today. And if you have any questions or comments, you can leave them with me. Remember, it's YouTube Masterclass Coursera. Thank you. We'll talk to you later. Bye.